Imagine being told that the absolute most arrogant, deeply flawed, and mathematically impossible criminal operation in the entire blood-soaked history of the American frontier was not orchestrated by brilliant criminal masterminds or highly trained military tacticians, but by a desperate, highly unstable family of disgraced former lawmen who were so completely obsessed with their own fading public image that they willingly walked into a devastating, heavily armed meat grinder of their own creation. They were told that this specific gang, led by men who used to wear the silver badge of the United States government, was going to pull off a historical first, a massive, synchronized double bank robbery that would completely eclipse the legendary status of Jesse James and instantly cement their names as the undisputed apex predators of the West. They were looking at a plan that required split-second timing, perfect biomechanical execution, and absolute psychological dominance over an entire town. Completely unaware that their massive, uncontrollable egos had blinded them to the raw, inescapable physics of a multi-shooter crossfire. Before we completely unlock the deeply tragic, intensely violent file on the greatest tactical disaster of the 19th century and break down the exact mechanical failures that led to the absolute annihilation of the infamous Dalton Gang, I need to know exactly who is standing shoulder to shoulder with us in the trenches of historical truth today. So I want you to drop your city in the comments below right now to heavily reinforce our global battalion, proving to the digital algorithms that our squad of uncompromising truth seekers demands the raw, violently unfiltered reality of the frontier without any of the sanitized Hollywood censorship. We are ripping the seal off the file of the Dalton brothers, specifically Bob, Grat, and Emmett, men who actually began their incredible, highly contradictory careers operating on the right side of the law, serving as heavily armed deputy United States Marshals in the incredibly dangerous, completely lawless void of the Indian Territory. Operating under the iron-fisted jurisdiction of the legendary Judge Isaac Parker, the Dalton brothers were initially highly respected, mechanically efficient lawmen who survived countless point-blank shootouts and perfectly understood the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of close-quarters survival, learning exactly how to track heavily armed fugitives and execute highly dangerous arrest warrants. But the massive, suffocating bureaucracy of the federal government frequently failed to pay their meager wages, leaving the brothers deeply frustrated, financially broken, and highly susceptible to the dark, magnetic pull of the outlaw lifestyle. Realizing that the exact same advanced tactical skills they used to hunt criminals could be seamlessly repurposed to aggressively extract massive amounts of wealth from the heavily guarded trains and banks of the frontier. Crossing that invisible, psychological line from lawman to outlaw fundamentally altered their central nervous systems, turning them into highly efficient, deeply paranoid predators who quickly assembled a heavily armed crew and began executing a series of highly successful, mathematically precise train robberies across the Oklahoma Territory. Utilizing explosive black powder charges to violently blow the heavy steel doors off express safes, and disappearing into the rugged terrain long before massive, heavily armed posses could ever be organized. However, success is a highly intoxicating, deeply dangerous chemical, and as the Daltons' massive haul of stolen wealth grew, so did the terrifying, uncontrollable ego of their tactical leader, Bob Dalton, a man who was deeply, obsessively jealous of the fading historical shadow cast by the legendary Jesse James. Bob Dalton coldly calculated that the only conceivable way to surpass the James Younger gang in the historical record was to execute a criminal maneuver so incredibly daring, so mathematically improbable, that it would completely shock the entire nation, leading him to engineer the fatal, highly arrogant plan to rob two separate banks simultaneously in broad daylight. The target he selected for this massive, unprecedented operation was the bustling, rapidly modernizing town of Coffeyville, Kansas, a location that represented the absolute ultimate tactical miscalculation, because the Dalton brothers had actually grown up in the immediate surrounding area, meaning that their faces, their physical mannerisms, and their writing styles were intimately familiar to almost every single citizen walking the dusty, sun-baked streets of the town. On the crisp, deeply tense morning of October 5th, 1892, the heavily armed five-man crew rode into Coffeyville, disguised in incredibly cheap, highly unconvincing, fake theatrical beards, a pathetic, almost comical attempt at psychological camouflage that instantly failed the absolute millisecond they entered the city limits, as multiple local merchants immediately recognized the notorious Outlaws through their ridiculous disguises. The gang's highly complex, synchronized plan instantly began to fall apart at the microscopic, mechanical level when they realized that the specific wooden hitching post they had mathematically designated for their extremely fast, highly kinetic escape had been completely removed for street repairs, forcing them to make a massive, devastating tactical error on the fly by tying their horses in a tight, deeply confined, dead-end space known as Death Alley, essentially stripping away their mobility and locking themselves into a completely inescapable, fatal geographic kill zone. Splitting their forces, a maneuver that fundamentally violates the most basic, foundational laws of concentrated firepower, Bob and Emmett Dalton aggressively stormed the First National Bank, while Grat Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell heavily breached the C.M. Condon & Company's bank directly across the wide, dusty street. Inside the Condon Bank, the incredibly arrogant Outlaws met their first massive mechanical obstacle in the form of a brilliant ground, highly composed cashier who utilized extreme psychological warfare against his heavily armed attackers, calmly lying to Grat Dalton by claiming that the massive, heavy steel vault was controlled by a complex time lock that would not physically disengage for another 3 minutes. A brilliant, physics-defying bluff that caused the heavily armed Outlaws to freeze their kinetic momentum and patiently wait, burning precious, unrecoverable seconds while the absolute apocalypse gathered outside. While the Daltons arrogantly waited for the fictional time lock to tick down, the citizens of Coffeyville did not cower in absolute fear like the helpless, terrified extras in a Hollywood production. Instead, the heavily hardened, deeply self-reliant men of the frontier instantly recognized the massive existential threat, immediately bypassing the slow, bureaucratic response of local law enforcement and sprinting directly to the local hardware stores, where the owners rapidly broke open heavy wooden shipping crates and distributed dozens of high-powered Winchester repeating rifles and hundreds of rounds of heavy lead ammunition to the furious townspeople. Within an absolute matter of seconds, the incredibly wide, exposed street separating the two banks was completely transformed into a highly tactical, massively overwhelming crossfire matrix, with heavily armed citizens taking up fortified, elevated firing positions on the flat roofs of surrounding buildings, behind heavy wooden wagons and inside brick storefronts, effectively trapping the divided, vastly outnumbered Outlaws in a devastatingly lethal web of intersecting kinetic energy. When the heavily armed Daltons finally realized that their perfectly synchronized plan had completely collapsed, they desperately attempted to exit the banks, stepping out into the bright Kansas sunlight and instantly running into a massive, deafening wall of high-velocity lead that violently tore through the air, shattering heavy glass windows, splintering wooden door frames, and absolutely shredding the Outlaws' carefully laid escape routes. Bob and Emmett Dalton, desperately realizing they were completely surrounded, executed a highly aggressive, deeply kinetic breakout attempt, utilizing their heavy Colt revolvers and Winchester rifles to unleash a massive barrage of suppressive fire, managing to violently break through the immediate perimeter and desperately sprinting back toward the suffocating confines of Death Alley, where their terrified horses were still tied. However, the absolute, unforgiving mathematics of a multi-shooter crossfire simply cannot be defeated by raw courage or sheer aggression. And as the Outlaws funneled themselves into the narrow, inescapable alleyway, the heavy, devastating volume of incoming fire reached a terrifying climax, with heavy rifle projectiles tearing completely through the dense brick walls and violently impacting human bone and tissue at hundreds of feet per second. Bob Dalton, the deeply arrogant architect of this massive tactical failure, was struck multiple times by heavy lead rounds, the massive kinetic shockwaves instantly destroying his internal organs and dropping him entirely lifeless into the dust, his massive ego permanently extinguished by the very citizens he had so deeply underestimated. Grat Dalton and Bill Power were similarly annihilated in the incredibly tight, confined space of the alley, their bodies violently torn apart by the relentless, deafening hail of civilian gunfire, while Dick Broadwell miraculously managed to mount his heavily wounded horse and desperately ride out of the kill zone, only to succumb to his massive, catastrophic biological trauma a mere half-mile outside of town, completely bleeding out and falling dead from the saddle into the dusty Kansas soil. The absolute, most terrifyingly miraculous survival story of this entire blood-soaked catastrophe belongs to the youngest brother, Emmett Dalton, who successfully mounted his horse with a massive bag of stolen currency. But instead of desperately spurring his mount toward freedom, he turned the animal around and rode directly back into the concentrated, devastatingly lethal center of the kill zone, in a desperate, highly loyal attempt to pull his dying brother Bob onto the back of his horse. In that specific, agonizing fraction of a second, as Emmett reached down through the choking cloud of thick black powder smoke, a local citizen armed with a heavy, double-barreled shotgun leveled his weapon at incredibly close range and completely unleashed a massive payload of heavy lead buckshot directly into Emmett's back and hips, instantly shattering his skeletal structure and violently blowing him entirely out of the saddle. Emmett Dalton hit the bloody, dust-choked ground of Death Alley, having absorbed an absolutely staggering, mathematically impossible total of 23 individual gunshot wounds, a level of catastrophic, deeply traumatic biological damage that should have instantly and permanently shut down every single system in his human body. Yet through sheer, physics-defying willpower and the bizarre miracles of frontier medicine, he completely survived the apocalypse, recovering from his massive injuries to stand trial and serve 14 grueling years in the Kansas State Penitentiary, before eventually moving to Hollywood and consulting on early Western films. The massive, deeply humiliating annihilation of the Dalton Gang in exactly 12 minutes of uninterrupted, extreme violence completely shattered the romanticized, Hollywood-fueled illusion of the untouchable outlaw, proving entirely and definitively that when highly arrogant, deeply flawed criminals attempt to mathematically outsmart the raw, collective firepower and unyielding, deeply territorial courage of normal, everyday citizens, the absolute, unforgiving laws of physics and kinetic energy will violently course-correct, leaving behind nothing but shattered egos and heavily blood-stained streets. Imagine being told that the absolute most heavily pursued, financially devastating train robber in the entire blood-soaked history of the Texas frontier was not a heavily scarred, battle-hardened Confederate guerrilla, or a brilliant calculating military tactician, but an incredibly simple, entirely illiterate teenage farm boy from the quiet cornfields of Indiana, who originally traveled west just to race a fast horse and experience the romanticized cowboy lifestyle. They laughed when they looked at his completely unassuming, painfully average appearance. A young man who spoke with a soft, polite drawl and casually handed out stolen dolls, freshly minted $20 gold coins to poor farmers with a bright, charming smile. Completely unaware that this deeply naive, incredibly charismatic kid was going to orchestrate the single largest gold heist in the history of the Union Pacific Railroad, and subsequently walk completely blind into one of the most heavily orchestrated, devastatingly lethal tactical ambushes ever engineered by the legendary Texas Rangers. Before we completely dissect the exact, catastrophic mechanical failures of this massive criminal operation and analyze the sheer grimp, brutal physics of the crossfire that ended his incredibly short, explosive life, I need to know exactly who is still holding the line with us in this dark, heavily entrenched historical trench. So I want you to drop your city in the comments below right now to solidify our global battalion, proving to the digital algorithms that our squad of uncompromising truth seekers absolutely demands the raw, violently unfiltered reality of the American frontier. We are ripping the seal off the deeply tragic, highly kinetic file of Sam Bass, a man born in 1851 who lost both of his parents at an incredibly young age, forcing him to flee the suffocating boredom of his uncle's Indiana farm and migrate to the sprawling, lawless expanses of Denton, Texas, looking for absolute freedom and fast money. Bass quickly realized that brutal, back-breaking manual labor was a mathematically impossible path to wealth, leading him to invest his meager savings into an incredibly fast, highly calibrated racing horse known locally as the Denton Mare, utilizing the animal's massive biomechanical speed to dominate the underground, high-stakes horse racing circuits of the Texas frontier. But the intoxicating, highly addictive rush of easy gambling money eventually dried up, forcing Bass and his fiercely loyal partner, Joel Collins, to attempt a massive cattle drive up to the booming, gold-crazed settlement of Deadwood in the Dakota Territory, where they immediately and completely squandered every single microscopic cent of their profits in the smoky, heavily armed gambling halls, leaving them entirely destitute and desperate in one of the most violent cities on the face of the earth. Faced with absolute financial ruin, Bass and Collins crossed an invisible, highly psychological threshold, calculating that aggressively extracting wealth from heavily guarded stagecoaches was significantly faster and infinitely more lucrative than driving cattle. Forming a heavily armed crew known as the Black Hills Bandits, and initiating a series of highly violent, though largely unprofitable, highway robberies. Realizing that robbing individual travelers was a massive waste of kinetic energy and high-velocity lead, Bass aggressively pivoted his tactical focus, targeting the absolute ultimate financial prize of the 19th century, utilizing extreme stealth and heavily armed intimidation to hijack the Union Pacific Gold Train at a remote water station in Big Springs, Nebraska, on a crisp September night in 1877. The gang violently stormed the heavy iron locomotive, brutally pistol-whipping the engineer and utilizing sheer, overwhelming psychological terror to force the express messenger to open the massive steel safes, discovering an absolutely staggering, mathematically incomprehensible payload of $60,000 in freshly minted, heavily gleaming gold coins, a physical weight of raw wealth so massive that the Outlaws could barely lift it onto their horses. This unprecedented, perfectly executed heist instantly transformed Sam Bass from a completely unknown drifter into the most heavily hunted fugitive in the entire United States, triggering a massive, multi-state manhunt fueled by the incredibly deep pockets of the railroad barons and the heavily armed agents of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Bass aggressively split the massive haul of gold and rode furiously back to the dense, familiar brush country of Denton County, Texas, where he immediately began utilizing his stolen wealth to purchase absolute loyalty, freely handing out heavy gold coins to struggling local farmers, paying for their groceries, and tipping bartenders with hundreds of dollars, brilliantly engineering a massive, deeply psychological shield of civilian protection that completely blinded local law enforcement and elevated him to the status of a legendary, untouchable folk hero. But the state of Texas fundamentally refused to tolerate this massive insult to their authority, prompting the legendary Major John B. Jones of the Texas Rangers to aggressively form a highly specialized, heavily armed task force specifically designed to mathematically analyze Bass's movements, completely sever his civilian supply lines, and hunt him down with extreme, uncompromising prejudice. For months, the heavily armed Rangers engaged in a brutal, exhausting war of attrition known as the Bass War, engaging the Outlaws in multiple, chaotic, high-velocity skirmishes in the dense Texas brush. But Bass constantly utilized his superior knowledge of the terrain and the absolute loyalty of the local population to slip through their heavily fortified perimeters. Major Jones coldly realized that attempting to defeat Bass in a raw, kinetic contest of speed and terrain was a failing mathematical equation, forcing the brilliant tactician to utilize a much darker, highly psychological weapon, secretly capturing a fringe member of Bass's gang named Jim Murphy and offering him a devastating, inescapable ultimatum. The Rangers coldly informed Murphy that unless he deeply infiltrated the gang and fed them exact, actionable intelligence regarding their next target, his own father would be brutally prosecuted and left to rot in a suffocating federal penitentiary, effectively weaponizing Murphy's biological loyalties and transforming him into a highly lethal, deeply embedded informant. Completely unaware of the massive, catastrophic betrayal slowly rotting his crew from the inside out, Bass confidently planned his next massive operation, arrogantly targeting the heavily fortified Williamson County Bank in the bustling, rapidly modernizing town of Round Rock, Texas, calculating that a lightning-fast, heavily armed strike would yield enough capital to flee the country and retire in Mexico. As the deeply paranoid outlaws slowly rode toward Round Rock in the sweltering heat of July 1878, Murphy secretly managed to slip away and aggressively transmit their exact tactical itinerary to Major Jones, allowing the Rangers to secretly flood the town, heavily fortifying the bank and positioning dozens of highly trained, heavily armed lawmen in concealed, elevated firing positions across the dusty streets, completely transforming the quiet settlement into a devastating, heavily orchestrated kill zone. On the afternoon of July 19th, Bass, his deeply loyal lieutenant Frank Jackson, and another outlaw named Barnes casually dismounted their horses and walked into town to physically scout the bank and purchase tobacco, completely and utterly blind to the massive, highly concentrated web of intersecting kinetic energy completely surrounding them. As the outlaws casually approached a local dry goods store, an incredibly brave, but deeply foolish, local deputy sheriff named A.W. Grimes, who was completely unaware of the massive Ranger ambush and simply thought the men looked suspicious, aggressively approached Bass, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder and asking him if he was carrying a concealed weapon. A fatal, microscopic miscalculation that instantly ignited absolute apocalypse. In an explosive, highly biological reaction, born of sheer panic and deeply ingrained combat reflexes, Bass and his men flawlessly executed a blindingly fast draw, instantly bringing their heavy Colt revolvers to bear and unleashing a devastating barrage of point-blank fire that violently impacted Deputy Grimes, instantly shutting down his central nervous system and dropping him entirely dead onto the dusty wooden boardwalk. The deafening, concussive roar of the heavy black powder revolvers instantly triggered the massive, heavily fortified Texas Ranger trap, and within an absolute fraction of a second, the wide, sun-drenched street was completely saturated with an overwhelming, deafening volume of high-velocity Winchester rifle fire tearing through the humid air from every conceivable angle. Bass desperately attempted to return fire, utilizing his heavy revolver to aggressively suppress the advancing lawmen, but the absolute, unforgiving mathematics of a perfectly orchestrated crossfire simply cannot be defeated by raw courage, and as he desperately retreated down a narrow, heavily exposed alleyway, a massive lead projectile violently impacted his right hand, completely shattering the bone and instantly disabling his ability to operate his primary weapon. Seconds later, a highly trained Texas Ranger named Richard Ware calmly leveled his heavy repeating rifle, mathematically calculated the extreme trajectory, and squeezed the trigger, unleashing a devastating, deeply concussive round that completely penetrated Bass's lower torso, violently shredding his internal organs, heavily damaging his kidneys, and instantly draining the legendary outlaw of all his kinetic momentum. As Bass collapsed into the dirt, heavily bleeding and completely paralyzed by the massive biological trauma, the absolute climax of this terrifying bloodbath occurred not through an act of law enforcement, but through a physics-defying display of raw, unparalleled loyalty by his incredibly young, heavily outnumbered lieutenant, Frank Jackson. Surrounded by dozens of heavily armed Rangers firing hundreds of high-velocity rounds, Jackson refused to abandon his dying leader, aggressively turning his heavy repeating rifle on the advancing lawmen and unleashing a massive, deafening wall of highly accurate suppressive fire, physically freezing the Rangers in their tracks, long enough for Jackson to miraculously lift the bleeding, shattered body of Sam Bass onto the back of his horse. Utilizing extreme, desperate biomechanics, and ignoring the terrifying hail of heavy lead snapping violently past his head, Jackson successfully mounted his own horse and successfully executed a completely impossible, mathematically absurd escape, violently breaking through the heavily fortified Ranger perimeter and riding deep into the Texas brush, leaving the terrified town of Round Rock completely engulfed in choking black powder smoke. But the massive, catastrophic internal damage inflicted by the heavy rifle round was absolutely irreversible, and after riding several agonizing miles, Bass physically could not remain in the saddle, forcing Jackson to leave him under a large oak tree, where he was eventually discovered the next morning by an aggressive posse of heavily armed Rangers. The once legendary train robber, the man who had freely handed out heavy gold coins and dominated the absolute peak of the Texas criminal underworld, spent his final hours in absolute, suffocating agony, heavily refusing to cooperate with his captors and famously stating that it was against his profession to betray his friends, maintaining his rigid, highly questionable code of honor until his severely damaged biological systems completely shut down on July 21st. Incredibly, his exact 27th birthday. The brutal, highly orchestrated annihilation of Sam Bass perfectly illustrates the terrifying, incredibly complex reality of the American frontier, proving entirely and definitively that absolute loyalty, raw charisma, and massive biomechanical speed will absolutely never overcome the cold, calculating mathematics of a heavily armed, perfectly synchronized ambush executed by men who understand the absolute physics of human destruction. We are currently fighting a massive, deeply existential war against a cold, calculating, algorithmic machine that actively wants to erase this ugly, brutal, incredibly complex truth of human history, a highly sanitized digital matrix that constantly tries to feed you watered-down, historically inaccurate, perfectly packaged slop deliberately designed to keep you entirely numb, comfortably ignorant, and completely compliant with their fake narratives. But we absolutely, fundamentally, refuse to let the true, raw, blood-soaked history of the American frontier fade quietly into the dark, digital abyss of forgotten memory. Because we are the ultimate keepers of the flame. The men who still deeply respect the complex mechanics of survival, who remember the harsh smell of black powder, and who understand the terrifying reality of a world completely without rules. The only conceivable way we defeat this massive algorithmic suppression, the only way we ensure that these incredible, deeply technical stories of human survival and tragedy are preserved for the next generation, is if you take this exact video and aggressively share it with every single person you know. Blast it across every corner of the internet. Force the digital system to acknowledge our massive presence, and let them know with absolute certainty that we are not going anywhere and we will not be silenced. I need you to go down into the comments section right now, look the digital beast directly in the eye, and type the words, "We hold the line." Imagine being told that the absolute most legendary, deeply mythologized, and seemingly invincible criminal syndicate in the entire violent history of the American continent was completely and utterly annihilated, not by a massive federal army, not by a legendary squad of highly trained Texas Rangers, and not by a brilliant mastermind of law enforcement, but by a completely random assortment of ordinary, everyday hardware store clerks, medical students, and quiet farmers. They were told that this specific gang, led by a man whose name had become completely synonymous with the very concept of the untouchable frontier outlaw, was an absolute force of nature, a terrifying phantom that could strike anywhere at any time and simply vanish into the mist, completely immune to the standard laws of physics and human consequence. They were looking at the legendary James Younger gang, heavily armed apex predators who had spent over a decade mathematically dissecting banks and trains across the Midwest, completely unaware that their massive, deeply uncontrollable egos were about to blindly march them into the most devastating, highly kinetic, and deeply humiliating tactical meat grinder of the 19th century. Before we completely tear down the shiny, Hollywood-manufactured mythology surrounding this legendary crew and dissect the exact brutal mechanics of their ultimate destruction, I need to know exactly who is standing shoulder to shoulder with us on the bleeding edge of historical truth today. So I want you to drop your city in the comments below, right now, to heavily reinforce our global battalion, proving to the digital algorithms that our massive squad of uncompromising truth seekers demands the raw, violently unfiltered reality of the frontier. We are ripping the seal off the deeply tragic, highly arrogant file of Jesse James and the Younger brothers. Men who originally forged their incredibly violent, sociopathic tendencies in the absolute blood-soaked crucible of the American Civil War, riding as heavily armed Confederate guerrillas under the terrifying command of William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson. In that horrific, mechanized slaughter, they completely mastered the complex, biomechanical arts of the rapid cavalry charge, the multi-shooter ambush, and the devastating utilization of heavy, black powder revolvers at incredibly close range, transforming their biological trauma into a highly lucrative, highly lethal post-war career. For over a decade, they terrorized the state of Missouri, utilizing a massive, highly sympathetic network of former Confederates who actively provided them with food, shelter, and critical tactical intelligence, allowing them to effortlessly outmaneuver massive posses and federal agents, creating an incredibly dangerous illusion of absolute invincibility. But the intoxicating, highly addictive chemical of long-term success eventually rots the tactical judgment of even the most brilliant predators, leading Jesse James to make an incredibly arrogant, mathematically catastrophic geographical miscalculation in the late summer of 1876. Desperate for a massive payday and deeply frustrated by the increasing heat in their home territory, the gang decided to ride hundreds of miles completely out of their established comfort zone, crossing deep into the unfamiliar, highly hostile northern territory of Minnesota, specifically targeting the First National Bank in the quiet, rapidly growing milling town of Northfield. Jesse coldly calculated that the peaceful northern farmers and merchants would instantly freeze in absolute terror the microscopic fraction of a second they saw heavy iron revolvers, completely underestimating the raw, uncompromising, and deeply territorial courage of men who had heavily survived their own brutal frontier hardships. On the incredibly tense, humid afternoon of September 7th, 1876, the heavily armed 8-man crew rode into Northfield, executing a deeply complex three-pronged tactical maneuver that they had mathematically perfected over dozens of successful heists, with 3 men entering the bank, 2 men aggressively securing the heavy wooden doors, and the remaining 3 creating a terrifying, highly kinetic perimeter in the center of the town square. As Frank James, Bob Younger, and Charlie Pitts violently stormed the interior of the bank, leaping over the wooden counter with their heavy Colt revolvers drawn, they met their very first, massive, insurmountable mechanical obstacle in the form of an incredibly brave, profoundly principled, acting cashier named Joseph Lee Haywood. When the heavily armed killers shoved the cold steel barrels of their weapons directly into Haywood's face and aggressively demanded that he immediately open the massive, heavy iron safe, Haywood executed an incredible, physics-defying display of absolute psychological dominance, completely refusing to comply with their terrifying demands, flatly lying to the legendary Outlaws by claiming the safe was secured by a complex time lock. The Outlaws, completely baffled by this unexpected, highly biological resistance from a simple civilian, violently dragged Haywood across the floor, brutally pistol-whipping him and discharging a heavy warning shot directly past his head. But the cashier rigidly maintained his absolute, uncompromising refusal, deliberately burning incredibly precious, unrecoverable seconds, while the absolute apocalypse began to aggressively gather just outside the heavy glass windows. Out on the wide, dusty street, the citizens of Northfield did not cower, did not beg, and absolutely did not freeze. Instead, a local merchant named J.S. Allen aggressively recognized the massive existential threat, sprinting down the wooden boardwalk and violently shouting for the town to get their guns, instantly transforming the peaceful settlement into a devastating, heavily orchestrated kill zone. The gang members operating the exterior perimeter desperately attempted to regain tactical control, executing a highly aggressive, deeply kinetic maneuver known as riding the street, violently spurring their horses into a dead sprint and unleashing a massive, deafening barrage of high-velocity lead into the air and surrounding storefronts, trying to utilize sheer, overwhelming psychological terror to drive the citizens back into their homes. But the citizens of Northfield fundamentally refused to be intimidated, quickly bypassing the panic and aggressively weaponizing the geometry of their town, with a local hardware merchant named A.R. Manning and a young medical student named Henry Wheeler instantly taking up highly fortified, elevated firing positions. Wheeler, finding an incredibly old, heavily outdated smoothbore military carbine in a local hotel, calmly positioned himself in a second-story window, mathematically calculated the complex trajectory of the moving targets below, and squeezed the heavy iron trigger, unleashing a massive lead projectile that violently impacted an outlaw named Clell Miller, instantly blowing him entirely out of his saddle and dropping him completely dead into the dusty street. Almost simultaneously, Manning utilized a highly accurate, breech-loading hunting rifle from the deeply concealed, highly fortified corner of a building, flawlessly tracking the chaotic, high-speed movement of the outlaws and firing a deeply concussive round that completely shattered the arm of Bob Younger, instantly degrading his ability to operate his heavy weapons. The absolute, unforgiving mathematics of the multi-shooter crossfire had completely trapped the legendary gang, and as the volume of high-velocity civilian fire reached a deafening, terrifying climax, another massive lead projectile violently struck Bill Chadwell, instantly shutting down his central nervous system and dropping him entirely lifeless from his horse, permanently severing the gang's primary geographical guide to the unfamiliar Minnesota terrain. Inside the bank, realizing that their perfectly synchronized plan had completely disintegrated into a catastrophic, blood-soaked disaster, the deeply frustrated outlaws violently executed the incredibly brave Joseph Lee Haywood, cowardly shooting the unarmed cashier in the head before desperately sprinting out the back door into the absolute, terrifying hail of heavy lead. The surviving members of the gang, completely shattered, deeply traumatized, and severely bleeding, desperately managed to mount their terrified horses and aggressively break through the immediate perimeter, fleeing into the dense, unfamiliar Minnesota wilderness without a single microscopic cent of the bank's currency, leaving behind 2 dead accomplices and completely destroying the terrifying illusion of their absolute invincibility. This catastrophic, highly humiliating defeat instantly triggered the largest, most heavily organized, and intensely brutal manhunt in the entire history of the United States, as hundreds of furious citizens, heavy law enforcement agencies, and heavily armed militias aggressively scoured the swamps and dense forests, completely severing the outlaws' supply lines and forcing them to endure weeks of absolute dig, suffocating starvation, and deep biological trauma. The legendary gang fundamentally fractured under the massive, crushing pressure, with Jesse and Frank James cowardly abandoning their heavily wounded comrades and successfully fleeing back to the familiar territory of Missouri, while the 3 younger brothers and Charlie Pitts were eventually cornered in a deeply treacherous, heavily wooded swamp known as Hanska Slough. In the resulting, brutally violent, highly kinetic final shootout with a massive civilian posse, Charlie Pitts was instantly annihilated by a devastating volley of heavy rifle fire, and the younger brothers were shot absolutely to pieces, with the legendary Cole Younger surviving, despite absorbing a mathematically impossible 11 individual gunshot wounds, a level of catastrophic biological trauma that perfectly illustrates the incredible, highly terrifying resilience of the human machine. The James Younger Gang, the undisputed apex predators of the post-war frontier, was permanently, utterly destroyed in a matter of exactly 7 terrifying minutes. Completely mathematically outsmarted and physically overwhelmed by ordinary men who simply refused to be victims. The brutal, highly orchestrated annihilation at Northfield perfectly illustrates the terrifying, incredibly complex reality of the American frontier, proving entirely and definitively that absolute, legendary status and massive biomechanical speed will absolutely never overcome the cold, calculating mathematics of a heavily armed, perfectly synchronized civilian crossfire executed by men who understand the absolute physics of protecting their own homes. We are currently fighting a massive, deeply existential war against a cold, calculating algorithmic machine that actively wants to erase this ugly, brutal, incredibly complex truth of human history. A highly sanitized digital matrix that constantly tries to feed you watered-down, historically inaccurate, perfectly packaged slop, deliberately designed to keep you entirely numb, comfortably ignorant, and completely compliant with their fake narratives. But we absolutely, fundamentally refuse to let the true, raw, blood-soaked history of the American frontier fade quietly into the dark, digital abyss of forgotten memory. Because we are the ultimate keepers of the flame. The men who still deeply respect the complex mechanics of survival, who remember the harsh smell of black powder, and who understand the terrifying reality of a world completely without rules. The only conceivable way we defeat this massive algorithmic suppression, the only way we ensure that these incredible, deeply technical stories of human survival and tragedy are preserved for the next generation, is if you take this exact video and aggressively share it with every single person you know. Blast it across every corner of the internet. Force the digital system to acknowledge our massive presence, and let them know with absolute certainty that we are not going anywhere, and we will not be silenced. I need you to go down into the comments section right now, look the digital beast directly in the eye, and type the words, "We hold the line."